And I'm pleased to have joining us right now. I've never met this man, but I'm appreciative of him calling in. I enjoyed watching him tell some of his stories in The Last Dance. He is the Catherine and Frank Price Endowed Chair for the Study of Race and Popular Culture and the Professor of Cinema and Media Studies at the USC School of Cinematic Arts. He's also known as Dr. B, or the notorious PhD. He's Dr. Todd Boyd here on The Rich Eisen Show. Dr. Boyd, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. I will give you the floor. What is going on in your mind today, Dr. Boyd? I know.
Well, there's a lot going on. It's hard to even narrow it down to one or two things. We're living in an interesting moment. We've all been inside our houses for the last few months because of COVID, and, that was traumatic and disruptive enough. Something I had never experienced in my life. And on the heels of that, as that is seeming to say slowly wind down or something of that nature, we have a situation, that we've seen numerous times now, so much that people know the names of these victims who've been killed on camera, and they circulate in our society. And, several of them, one right after the other, and then, people's response to it over the last week in the streets. So there's a lot going on, and you try to make sense of it, but you have to live through it at the same time.
So you were, if I'm not mistaken, you're a native Detroiter, right?
Yes,
you're a Michigander, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so does part of you, are you shocked, surprised at all that we're still having the same conversation that I'm sure you were hearing or seeing on the streets of Detroit as you were growing up there, Dr. Boyd?
I'm not surprised at all. I'm actually not even so fazed by it, honestly, because, if you're fortunate enough to get some years behind you in this life, you see a lot of things. When I was very, very young, Detroit in the late 1960s had a very famous riot, uprising, rebellion, whichever choice of terminology you decide on. And it was very profound because, of course, in this moment, the city became, in essence, a new city because, this phenomena sociologists call white flight. White people left Detroit and moved to the suburbs. Detroit became an entirely black city, black mayor, just black in its identity. But I remember my father telling me stories about going to the World Series in '68, and Marvin Gaye sang the national anthem, and he sang it in a very traditional way, quite different than he did in the '80s in Los Angeles when, that famous performance at the Forum at the All-Star game. But he saw Jose Feliciano sing the national anthem, and Jose Feliciano was booed because, of course, he sang the national anthem in his own style. And my father, who wasn't familiar with Jose Feliciano's music, but just couldn't abide by the fact that they were booing this man and, throwing things at him. And he just really, he says, hey, the man did his own thing, and this is your response. So, I grew up in an environment where, in that time and immediately after in the 70s, so many things. Nixon era, poverty, crime, drugs, all those things we can tick off. And, Los Angeles in the early 90s, has come up also quite a bit lately. So, when you live through this enough, you see it, and it takes different shapes and forms. But if the root causes don't change, then you can expect, a recurrence. And I think that's what we're seeing now. People just have a really stronger response to it, and at the same time, you're able to see it spread out on social media in ways that you were not able to see in times previous. So it's different in that regard, but in other ways it's the same.
No doubt, Dr. Boyd. I'm sitting there, and it's I've got 3 kids at home cooped up. They're already cooped up because of, COVID. And now, they're hearing that awful alarm go off on my phones at night, wondering if, something's happening. And I tell them something is happening out there. And I look down at my phone and I'm trying to be present for them, but I can't be, to be very honest, refreshing my phone and just seeing one horrific scene after another wind up in the palm of my hand. And it just makes me wonder if everything is going to hell and what can I do? What can we do? I know you're laughing, but that is essentially what I want to ask many of my guests today. I'm a 50-year-old Jewish white man. I've never been pulled from a car. I've never been pulled over because of the color of my skin. I've never ever had a knee on my neck. I've never had that. So I'm kind of wondering how I can join hands here and what we can do together.
Well, I've been answering that question a lot, certainly over the last few days. I don't know if my answers have been sufficient, but I think in some ways it's like, whenever there's an emergency, people scramble to deal with the emergency, but perhaps that's not the preparation or execution that you want to have. In general, when there's an emergency, you have to act, but if you plan and execute otherwise, you might be able to prevent the emergency. So we're in an emergency phase. We've gotten past what we could have done. It's kind of hard right now to say what you can do. We have to let these things play out. But what I've also been saying to people is, and this sounds simple, I don't know, people sometimes ask that question, and it's like they want, the sort of miraculous answer, do this and everything will be okay, but of course it doesn't work that way.
Right.
I think, as I keep saying to people, it starts with people educating themselves, really, which is a fairly simple sounding thing. It's more difficult than that to execute, but it really comes down to education and knowing that we live in a society that has often sold itself as a great society, but of course it was not great for everyone. America's often sold itself as a great nation, but it's not been great for everyone. It's been great for some people. And the attitude has been, if it's not great for you, then that's your fault. When, there are inequities and inequalities built into a system that has benefited people differently based on, their identity. And so when we think about, what all that means, if you don't know that this exists, then you look at a situation and you say, why would a police officer break the law? Their job is to uphold the law, and you just don't believe that, a police officer would do something so reprehensible in spite of the fact that they may have done it. I think they call it cognitive dissonance. But if you don't have that knowledge and education, if you have no empathy and are unable to live in other people's shoes, at least vicariously, then, nothing ever changes because you only look at it a certain way. So that's what I mean when I say educate yourself. That's where it starts. And then from that, recognize that we live in a society that is still very divided, and there are numerous disadvantages and long-standing issues that consistently need addressing. I think that's where we have to start, even though it looks like maybe it's a bit late to be doing so right now, but that's really what it's about.
Dr. Todd Boyd of the USC, professor of cinema, media studies, race and popular culture as well, right here on the Rich Eisen Show. What if sports were going on right now, right? What if sports was? We're seeing statements from the biggest names in all of sports. But what if we actually, if there was no COVID-19 and there'd be games tonight? What do you think?
I think in some ways, some of what we've seen transpire in the streets over the last week is directly due to the fact that people have been, cooped up in the house for the last few months. A lot of this is beyond politics or ideology. People are restless, I think, which is kind of ironic and funny in a strange way. But I think that's part of it. So, if there's no COVID and we've been watching sports for the last few months, I mean, like, it's normal. Who knows what the reaction is. I think there'd still be a strong reaction to these videos of, joggers getting killed by private citizens in Georgia and, police putting their necks on individuals in Minneapolis and, woman getting killed in Louisville, et cetera. I mean, those things would prompt a response.
I guess I'm not to interrupt, but I guess I asked the question poorly. I guess the way I'm saying is we've seen so many times the sports take the lead in this country on showing how people should act and react. Right? I mean, that we've in a perfect example that so many people wouldn't even think of quarantining. Yeah, well, let's shut down the economy until Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz tested positive for coronavirus, and then the sports league started shutting down in ways that we didn't get from leadership on the federal level.
Right.
So I guess that would be the way that I'm framing the question.
I'm thinking though. And perhaps you remember this back in '92, the riots following the Rodney King verdict, and NBA playoffs were going on. And it felt at that time as though the playoffs took a back seat. The playoffs were secondary in that moment. I mean, obviously sports plays such a prominent role in our society, and athletes are very visible. I think had sports not stopped, were it still going on, people would be able to see athletes in what we might call their natural habitat. They wouldn't just be at home like we all are, but instead would be participating in their sports and, interviews and press conferences. There'd be a lot more dialogue and opportunities to participate in shaping the narrative. I don't think athletes would control it, but I think they could certainly participate in enhancing the narrative in a way that's, not gone on just because of the circumstances of COVID. So imagining that would be a different way of thinking about how you could, particularly in the age of social media, when athletes are able to, reach their followers directly. I think you could imagine a different set of circumstances, but at the same time, the magnitude of the events may very well have trumped athletics, at least for a time.
So did any of the statements from any of the players stand out to you, where you thought that was particularly profound or surprising that the voice it came from at all?
Well, I've noticed what has caught my attention, not necessarily one or two statements or any statements that have been necessarily profound, but I think what has attracted my attention is the volume of statements. There's been a large number of statements from, corporations, institutions, as well as individuals. And in each of these, I've seen people who have commented on police brutality of, African Americans being killed, solidarity with black people. The tone and the sentiment and the volume of them has caught my attention more so than any, individual statements. It seems to be more pervasive throughout society. I mean, if you go on Instagram today, people are blacking out their page. So I guess I feel like this is interesting what's transpiring, but there's a lot of people who seem to be on the right side of this in larger numbers than maybe we've seen in the past. That's what's caught my attention more so than the substance of anybody's statement so far.
And Dr. Todd Boyd here on the Rich Eisen Show, and many of my listeners and viewers may recognize the voice face also from the documentary The Last Dance that was quite popular over a 5-week period on ESPN. And, how about the fact that it's 2020 and Jordan is putting out a statement on this subject that he is still considered one of the titans of our sports world, and it is now, almost 2 decades since he's actually laced him up, Dr. Boyd.
Well, when you talk about Mike, I mean, you're talking about one of the, maybe 2 or 3 most popular athletes in American history. So, that's a very lofty status. I think, one of the things that came up on The Last Dance was that conversation about, Mike's refusal to or desire not to endorse Harvey Gantt back in the early 90s
Yes.
when he was running against Jesse Helms. I think knowing what he knows now, he recognizes that was a missed opportunity. And I think what we've seen from him since that time on a number of issues has been at least, more public association with political issues through statements, through donations, through things of this nature. But everybody's sitting up in the house because of COVID, and ESPN moves up, the Last Dance documentary. Everybody's watching and talking about it. It almost felt to me like we were back in that era when there were only 3 networks and everybody was watching the same thing. It's rare that, everybody's sort of zoned in on, one show. I think that broke up the boredom, and it also increased the number of people who want to know who the maker of my eyeglasses are. So,
well, I mean, you want to throw that. You want to throw that out there and answer the question? I mean,
well, I have not answered the question because with me, as I'm sure you can tell, just in our conversation, it's never yes or no. It's never simple.
Yes.
So I'm going to be quiet for now, and then I'm going to hold a decision-like press conference the way LeBron did and make the announcement.
Okay.
That's what I've decided to do.
If you want me to play the role of Jim Gray, I'll do that for your.
Let's do it, man. Let's do it.
Be more than happy to do that. Did you learn anything from that documentary? Is there something that you picked up from that you did not know or needed a question answered?
I wouldn't say I learned anything because I have been studying, that era and those times, and I've written books about it and been immersed in it. I lived it,
Yes.
First time I met, Mike was back in Detroit in the late 80s after watching him unfortunately give my Pistons 59 points on Easter Sunday. That was back in the late 80s. So, having lived it and, of course, the work I do, having studied it, there's not much to learn. It was nice to, at least for me, because I try to be on top of that, but it was nice to relive all that. And I guess if I had one favorite moment that didn't involve myself, it was watching Mike laugh at Gary Payton, and just the way he said the glove with that question mark and exclamation point at the end of it. Just that response is to me, that's the documentary right there. Like, the glove as he looks at that iPad. But, there's a lot of moments in there that are funny and kind of nice to relive all that. I think it was a excellent presentation, and I think it did a lot, for the people who watched it in terms of dealing with the monotony that sort of COVID had brought into our lives.
No question about it. And I had David Aldridge on the show Friday, Dr. Boyd, and I said to him, at least you weren't one of those people on the iPad handed to Jordan. You did not want to be that person. When that happened during the doc, that was the last thing you wanted to be, was the person on an iPad that Jason Hare, the director, handed to Jordan for his perusal.
Yes.
And immediate reaction. And by the way, that I would take an 11th episode of all the cutting room floor moments. I'm sure not all the iPad moments being handed to Michael made it on the air, I would imagine.
Right. Well, you could easily do the making of The Last Dance. That'd be interesting as well.
And could you imagine if there was in social media when Rodman was playing, Dr. Boyd? Could you imagine what that would have been like?
The entire time I'm watching the documentary, I just kept thinking if all of this had transpired during the era of social media, I mean, Rodman would have certainly demanded attention, but, to have lived through that myself with no social media now, recognizing how the world has changed because of social media. I mean, Rodman marrying himself in the age of social media, I mean, that would have most certainly broken the internet, as they say. It's kind of hard to imagine, but at the same time, when you think about that era, you think about the fact that there was no social media, and here we are, 20-plus years later, and it's like it just happened yesterday. So that speaks to, how those moments cemented themselves in our culture and our history. The fact that, we're still into it, so many years having passed. A lot of people do things that in the moment they're popular, and then, particularly now, 24-hour news cycle, there's a new story every day. But you look at that and you're like, this happened 22, 30 years ago, depending on the episode and the segment, and we're still talking about it. So that tells us how important it is to our culture.
No doubt. So my last question for you, Dr. Boyd, and I appreciate the time this morning. A show like this one at the crossroads of pop culture, sports, life. You are at the crossroads of race and popular culture. What do you think shows like this one should be like moving forward here over the next day, 2-3 weeks? In terms of people, I'm curious as a host of a show like this one, what you think should be the topic of conversation here.
Well, those things you mentioned, you talk about popular culture, you talk about race. I mean, I've always, focused on popular culture because popular culture is something we as a society enjoy. But through popular culture, through sports, there's so much more going on. Sports has been one of the most visible areas in our society in terms of the issue of race for a long time, So there's ways to talk about political issues, racial issues, and sports issues, cultural issues, societal issues. I mean, these things are all connected. A lot of times people try to separate them in their own lanes. Sports and politics don't mix, but sports and politics are life, and they do mix. And I think the conversation has to be, as you've done through sports, that's what you do, but you use that as an opportunity to talk about, bigger issues, more profound issues. Sports is just the introduction, the intro, but you go from there into something that talks about ultimately American society, our country, the culture. I mean, sports, popular culture, that's the surface, but we're going deeper. And I think that emphasis on going deeper and how this explains our society at this time is the way perhaps you could consider proceeding.
Okay, I appreciate the advice, the thoughts. If you ever have a class on what would you say, the issue of sticking to sports, I'd be happy to speak to your class. I get that response quite a bit on my social media feeds. # stick to sports, all that stuff. Stick to the NFL, all that sort of business. Right. I get that a lot. So
right, I can imagine.
Thank you for the time, Dr. Boyd. Really appreciate it, and I hope your family is healthy, well, and safe.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It's Dr. Todd Boyd here on the Rich Eisen Show.